Yeah, I almost feel like, in fact, every time that I'm described as a president, I slightly inwardly wince because we just use this. I don't even know how the word comes, but every year I go to a meeting with all the other presidents in Sri Ratna, and I always, every single meeting, I say, "Can we change the name of what we're called?" But anyway, it's just somebody. I mean, what we do emphasise in Sri Ratna, and if you know anything about us, you'll know this, is friendship, and it's friendship in relation to the Dharma, and so that's what it feels like when I come here. It's there isn't any. I don't have like any official duties. I don't think it is just a kind of part of an informal, or sort of crosses a line between informality and formality. Just a network of support that we've got for centres all around the world. So it's just good to have somebody from, as Padma said, he said, outside of a centre, just like to come and ask how people are getting on and give a bit of help if it's ever needed. Yeah, so tonight, persistence and paradox. So again, this is something I'm particularly interested in. I'll tell you why. It's like, how do you keep going when you embark on some kind of project of growth and development? You often can start off really enthusiastic, or out of absolute need that you need to make some significant change in your life, and then it is like, how do you keep going? So that's the really interesting bit for me, is how do you keep going? And I think that just generally in life, most people will be familiar with this. We often start things which, they may take some years. If you embark on a training, sometimes, like a degree can be 3 years, but sometimes if you have to train part-time while you're working, it could be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So, we are familiar in our kind of context and society of actually following long-term plans of action through. But at the same time, there's something about, I'm just going to be talking in sort of, specifically a Buddhist context of like embarking on a path of change and development using the Buddha's teachings. But I think it is translatable to other contexts, as like how that happens and how you kind of see something through. So I've been interested in this just in my own life, and I thought I would share a few thoughts. I think I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I've got 6 kind of thoughts, if you like, or that have been helpful to me, or just ways of thinking about how to keep going. Even that language of keeping going, this was the paradox thing, and because I talk about paradox wherever I go. It's just like my favourite theme. So I've already done that a little bit last week and the week before. I know not all of you were here, so I probably won't say so much about that tonight. It does come up in 1 or 2 places. Now, often when we give talks, Buddhist talks, we often we're directly relating to a word or a theme that comes from the Buddhist, canon. But persistence is not a direct translation of any words that I know of, that I've come across in the kind of, from the Buddhist texts. So we do use some other words. There's a word like, there's a Buddhist use of, there's a specific word that's translated as effort in Buddhist. I think it's said viyama or viyamo. And it often relates to mindfulness, just like applying mindfulness. There's also a word which is translated as energy, which comes from the Buddhist canon. The word is virya, and perhaps that comes quite close to persistence. We also talk about faith quite a lot in Buddhism, actually, which is the word is shraddha or saddha, and often faith is seen as a way of developing a quality that is like persistence, like something. What is it that keeps you going through thick and thin? So, there is this kind of context, but when I say persistence, I just mean like what keeps you going. Yeah, what keeps me going. That's all I mean, in fact. I think if you looked it up in a dictionary, it would say continuing steadfastly. But it also can have a connotation of like, especially when things get a bit difficult. Yeah. So what you do definitely find in the Buddhist canon, like again and again, is the Buddha kind of exhorting whoever is listening to him that you do need to get on with it. Actually, if you really, if like you really want to do something meaningful, you really want to develop freedom. The Buddha's own quest was all about looking for an end to suffering, the suffering that just seemed endemic in life. And so he was always saying, okay, if you think this is the right path to go, well, get on with it. And there's like literally dozens and dozens of examples of the way that he would sort of enthuse or exhort people. There's a classic one. This one I've got here, which is, in fact, it's him talking to a group of nuns, and it says, very simple. Here are the roots of trees. Here are empty places. Sit down and meditate. Don't be lazy. Don't become one who is later remorseful. That's it. And when he says, like, here are the roots of trees, here are empty places, that was just like, in other words, go and meditate in solitude. That was often that the Buddha. It's almost like a classic formula that say, go to an empty hut, sit at the root of a tree, or just find a glade in the forest or something like this, and just get on. So I mean, Buddhist practice is not all about meditation, but that's the kind of almost like one of the formulas that comes down to us. So what I'm talking about is how to keep going in the long term. And there's another beautiful Buddhist word, sati, which is the word that we commonly use or translate as mindfulness, but it also means continuity of purpose. So how do you keep a continuity of purpose going? And another really interesting thing for me is we often think of like, how do you keep going when things are difficult? But if you like, there is a bit of a paradox, I think, in Buddhist tradition and training, that to really, I'll try and explain this as simply as I can, but to really see and flow with the kind of nature of reality, it's quite a big thing to do, and it has a really quite disturbing effect on the psyche, actually. And so the Buddhist training that we follow in Triratna, which is very traditional, is like a successive stages where you first of all develop integration, just like psychological integration and positive emotion. And this is preparation, if you like, for what's called vipassana or insight. Now, this is really interesting. In other words, the language that we sometimes use is that you actually work on yourself, best done with some other people, to develop some integration and become, what you might just call a happy, healthy human being. It's a phrase we quite often use in Triratna. A happy, healthy human being. And this is the basis on which you can then develop real freedom by actually really looking at your mind, really, really examining it and seeing which way is freedom. And the freedom is just like quite gently. Sometimes it can be like an eruption, but hopefully, there's some, what would you call it? Opening up, just like opening up your kind of egoic defences, yeah? The ego is so strong and so on, and we think that our freedom is actually by sort of defending ourselves and choosing preferences and all the rest of it. But actually, freedom comes from opening up to other people and to life. But it's not an easy thing to do. So the paradox is that the Buddhist path will actually create hopefully anyway, a kind of a better you. But of course, a better you also then you think, oh, a better me, great. I'll just carry on like this, thank you very much. So you have to somehow still be motivated to do the work, to face the really, sometimes quite uncomfortable bits of yourself that you'd prefer not to look at. Yeah, so, it's not exactly a paradox, but it's in that territory. So the danger is that you can, we have another phrase for this as well we sometimes use called spiritual bypassing, which is like you learn the right language and the right kind of communication and the right sort of thing to kind of actually bypass the things that you should really be looking at. Yeah? That's a possibility. So it's like, this is a question to me. Well, here I am, I'm 20 years on the path. How do I not do that? Actually, I do actually want the freedom. I mean, some of you know my story. I mean, I was propelled onto the path by just having a pretty horrible nervous breakdown. I do not want to go back, to that kind of place. And yet somehow it has been kind of going back there, but with a much more integrated self. I can actually examine the things that I was trying to examine or forced to examine all those years ago, and actually finding it almost like catastrophic in that time. So, the developmental work is kind of so I can go back there and have a better look this time round. So it's interesting stuff. Anyway, these are my 6 points of the things that have been helpful along the way, if you like. How to be a little bit persistent. So some of these are really obvious. Some of them might be new. First one, recognise the changes you have made. Yeah, it's quite a common thing that you'll find in sort of self-help books and so on. But actually, what's really good for this is other people. Yeah, other people can see changes that you've made in yourself that you can't see yourself. And I've noticed this in myself, and I notice it with a lot of people around me, that the view of ourselves that we have, when you embark on a path of change, the view of yourself, of those changes, lags way behind some of the changes that you've actually made. You're actually further ahead than you think you are. It just seems a kind of psychological function that we still, maybe there's sort of inherent biological safety reasons why it's like that. I'm not sure, but the view of ourselves, it lags behind, and other people can just help you go, actually, you've done really well. I can see some real changes that you've made. I can see that you're different. 1 year, 5 years, whatever. And a friend of mine, Sangadeva in the UK, he's got a lovely phrase for this. He calls it witnessing the enlightening process. Because, enlightenment, Buddhist enlightenment can seem like this all incredible kind of distant goal or something, some reified state. But he said the enlightening progress is those simple steps of like changing habits, moving slowly towards freedom, even learning to communicate better. These are enlightening factors. And he says if you can witness another person changing, he says, well, for him, it's the most satisfying thing he's ever done in his life, is actually be able to witness the changes that somebody else is making. And he says that he teaches a lot of, introductory courses and so on. He says very often he can, within 3 to 6 months of someone coming along, there's some significant change that he can see in them. And when that is witnessed, it's a really powerful agent of change that makes you want to carry on, basically. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, this is an interesting one, go back to some of the places where you've been before and check who you are. Yeah, so I do this. There's something really magical and mystical to me about just like geographic place. Like sometimes I go back to my childhood. It's a very quiet little valley where I grew up in England. And now when I go back there, it's almost like, I can see who I am going back. It's just like quite significant, even the journey as I approach it. I just quite easily get into this kind of like a reflective state of like, when was I last here? Might have been a couple of years ago, or even sometimes I just slip straight back to 25 years ago, and I think, oh yeah, I do feel like a different person. I think it can also be important if you make, I'll get onto this in a bit, but if you make some important resolution, note the place that you make it. Yeah, don't just make it in any old place in a way, or remake it in a significant spot. And then you always can revisit this spot later on and just go, how am I doing? How am I doing? So don't underestimate the geography, I think is what I'm trying to say there. Yeah, so maybe I'll just say something about making resolves, if you like, because I do feel that's been very important to me. So one way I describe this to myself is that I feel like I made a really strong resolve to practice the Buddha's teachings in this context of this community. It's the end of 1996. I'd only literally been learning to meditate for a few weeks then, but I just made a really strong resolve that I'd found something, and I'd been on the edge of all sorts of kind of social change groups and kind of even like theatre and all kinds of stuff, and I thought, I'm actually going to step in to the, as far into the middle as I can get with this group, and I'm going to try and stay there. And it was really significant. I'll tell you, again, this is my own language, but I felt like I set a resolve, and what I was doing was it was like this process of transformation was going on in me inside, and it was almost unconscious, and I could just let it run. Like, I did need to do things on the surface. There were like particular patterns of communication and just like some integration and so on that I still needed to be working on the surface of my being, but I was pretty confident by making this resolve, I'd started some deeply interior process going. I was with Danta Chitta in your chapter the other day, and I said I had this army of dwarves that I'd set running inside me. I wasn't sure whether they were like digging down in my unconscious or building a tower inside me, but they would, they're like this like army of little beings that are at work, and I can just let them get on with it. I can just I kind of trust that something's going on. It's important to every so often for me just to revisit that resolution and just go, am I still honouring it? Yeah, am I still honouring it? But somewhere, I think it's still happening. There's also a whole class of practices which you can undervalue a bit in the kind of modern scientific world. A whole set of devotional practices that some of us do in Triratna, like puja, even reading sutras, any act of devotion. And I think these are the sort of practices that are actually they relate to that kind of interior work that is kind of something that is started in me. Like when I do puja, I often even imagine that the words sort of make sense to me, but they're actually going right deep inside me to some bit of my psyche that I'm barely aware of, that is slowly, being kind of chipped away at. Sound mad? Anyway, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Okay, well, look, now for a much more normal one then. Break your goal down into manageable chunks. That's a very common way of operating, isn't it? When you've got some big project, you just break it down to step by step and work on particular aspects of it. So, just like a meditation practice or a particular habit you might want to work out or something. It's a very, very common way, and it's a very effective way of working. I also think, though, that there's something about when you set a goal. I mean, in Buddhism, we talk about rebecoming. In other words, we don't just think of this lifetime. So that can be an alien concept for some people, but it's worth even just reflecting. Like sometimes I think, is this just this lifetime project that I'm embarking on? I can kind of get behind it, but sometimes I think maybe it's like a 1,000,000-year project, and I don't actually know how far into it I am, or do you know what I mean? But maybe it's like some kind of really weird life. I don't know. I mean, just some kind of time scale that I don't really have a comprehension of. It's not like I've got a whole store of past life memories or anything. I mean, I've met people who really do think that they've had past life memories. They're really they just cannot. They've tried to find other explanations and they don't. But I think it's just even worth holding the possibility of that, even though it goes against a modern materialist view. That you might be embarking on something, or you might be in the middle of something, or you might be almost completed something. Its origin is very difficult to know, and its end point might also be very difficult to know. So, anyway, I'll just leave that there. Number 4, recognise that even good habits can become stale. Yeah, this is just like this. You're just working with the nature of mind in recognising this, I think. That something that starts off, it's just a very natural thing. Something that starts off really fresh, you've got bundles of enthusiasm for it. Even good habits, they can kind of your enthusiasm for them can just kind of tail off a bit. And sometimes I think it's good to have interruption, change of scene, review. I think these are good things. What's really interesting, and I haven't got an answer for this, is when it's important to keep going with something that you've undertaken, and when is the time that it might need some change. It's actually quite a difficult thing to know. And again, the best thing I think I could suggest is that you talk to friends about it. Also, I say listen to your intuition. I mean, intuition isn't always right, and it needs to be backed up by some other things, maybe a bit more reasoned analysis. But I think sometimes if it gets energetically more difficult to engage with in some kind of positive pattern of behaviour that you've set up in your life, it's probably telling you something. And I've talked about this before, but I've given myself permission to take on some kind of job or some responsibility, and that when it comes to an end, I just give myself a period of what you might call deep assimilation, where I just don't take on any more responsibility for. I've been fortunate enough to financially be able to do this. I might have several months, even a year, where I actually don't take on any responsibility and just sort of, I don't know, have a fallow period, if you like. So not everybody needs to do this, but it's just, I think we know that even good habits do wane, if you like, and consistency is good, but it's like an intelligent recognition that sometimes you just need a change and you need to freshen something up, and it's all right to do that. Actually, it's more than all right. It may be vital. So 2 more to go. The 5th one is recognise the conditions you need in order to make positive change in your life. Now, we talk about this quite a lot, not just in Triratna, actually. I've got friends who practice in other Buddhist communities and Christian communities as well, and they often say something a bit similar. But recognise the conditions you need. It's just like such an important thing. And I know this directly from my own experience, because I tried practicing as a Buddhist for 10 years on my own. And I think it was one of the factors that led to my nervous breakdown, actually, of just like, in a sense, like if you get some teachings a little bit wrong, actually you can really do yourself some mischief. So learn the conditions. That's why we emphasise connection and friendship in Triratna. It's just like some of those conditions is simply having a few trusted others around you. But whatever your conditions are, whatever you think is helpful, cherish them. At the same time as that, again, this is one of the paradoxical points. Don't get too precious about what your conditions are, yeah? Because the path is actually about freedom, and freedom means not getting too caught up with your own preferences, because they will lead, in fact, to suffering. They will lead to more suffering if you get really precious about what you need. And in the end, the Buddhist teachings are mind training. So all you need is your mind. In other words, you can actually apply Buddhist training whatever your circumstances are. And it's been really helpful for me just to think of this, so that when I'm in really difficult places and really difficult times, I think, well, here I am. I've got some of the Buddhist teachings. They're quite simple, really. We've got mindfulness and metta and ethics, and I've got some other things I've been given. I can just apply this to the situation that I'm in right now. You can just apply it, and that's really helpful. It's something that's it's sometimes called take everything onto the path, this teaching, which means you apply all of your Buddhist training just to whatever's in front of you. Yeah, so it's a bit of a double practice, and again, it could be a bit paradoxical, but yeah, conditions are really important. Trying to do that, trying to find some other people, trying to find some stability, trying to find some a positive environment. I think they're really important things, and at the same time, don't be too precious. I'm talking very quickly tonight, aren't I? Anyway, number 6. So again, this is my fundamental paradox, if you like, which is strive, like, in other words, make effort, but at the same time find enjoyment and ease. So, that for me, that's the fundamental paradox, and I've grown to love it. Yeah, I've grown to really love this one, that I really want to make an effort. I really want to, almost like, there is something about being quite methodical and meticulous in your life, like really being quite careful with how you act, how you communicate, how you plan things, and at the same time just having a complete sense of ease, a sense of freedom, a sense of spontaneity, a sense of playfulness. and trying to do both. I mean, it's a bit of an art, as it were. Usually what happens is you kind of do a bit of one and a bit of the other. Daytime, nighttime. But it's really, I really believe that there's a kind of freedom comes as you try and become that paradox. You try and become that paradox. And that is one of the things that keeps me going. I've got a kind of curiosity about this one that enables, because I've got that, it's like, how do you do that? How do you make an effort and at the same time be completely at ease? I'm like, wow, that's really interesting, isn't it? So that, to go back to the beginning there, in terms of persistence, that is one of the fundamental ways in which I persist. Now, it may not be everybody's way, but it's great if you can find your own kind of curiosity koan that works for you, that just keeps that alive. So whatever you're doing with your life, whether you call it Buddhist or not, you actually have something that just like, yeah, I've set something in motion here. Let's just keep that going and see what happens. So I think that's probably I think there's something that can happen if you're living out a kind of koan in your life. It can actually, in some direct ways, but also in some mysterious ways, it's a gift to other people as well. I often feel, as I think one of the other talks, I said this idea of the ideal Buddhist as someone who kind of resolves paradox. That is actually, even the attempt is quite a rare thing. And it's a beautiful thing to offer. And I keep on coming across people in our community who I think my language is resolving. Yeah, it's the language I try and use myself. And I like it because it means that I'm not perfect, but I'm having a go. And there's something to show for it. Yeah, I'm resolving. And I keep coming across people who I feel the same thing. I think, yeah, there's something resolving. There's something resolving. They may use a completely different language to me, but it's a really lovely thing to be able to offer. Because what it does is admit to the complexity and ambiguity of the world, but also to the wonder and mystery of being human. So that's what I feel. Anyway, it's one of the things I think our community can really offer. And maybe just, there's something similar I see actually in other traditions as well, but I just think it's particularly clear in the Buddhist tradition, and it's particularly clear in the bit of the Buddhist tradition that we most emphasise, what's called the Bodhisattva ideal or the Mahayana. So anyway, I think they're my thoughts on persistence. I don't think I'll even go over them again. I'll just leave it there. That's, it's just me trying to answer the question of how I keep going and how I stay curious and stay engaged with, the path that I set in train 20 years ago. And, good days and bad days, but generally speaking, I feel it's going pretty well. Thank you.